to add my welcome to everybody else's. It's absolutely lovely to see you all in person at this conference. Welcome to the EUA 2022 Annual Conference. And it's my great pleasure to chair this first session of the conference and to introduce four really distinguished speakers to the panel who are going to share their expertise and views with you in the next hour and a bit. I'm not going to read out their biographies to you in great detail. You have the conference booklet and you can read all about them in that, but just a very brief introduction. So we have with us today Adam Bodnar, who is Dean of the Law Faculty at the SWPS University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Warsaw, Poland, and is also a former Ombudsman of the Republic of Poland. We have Christian Ehler, who is a member of the European Parliament, has been since 2004. He's one of the leading figures in the design and implementation of EU research and innovation programmes. He was rapporteur for both Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. He's also Vice Chair of the European Parliament think tank STOA, which many of you will be familiar with. Then joining us online, we have David Kay, who's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine, and a Director of its International Justice Clinic. And until 2020, David served as United Nations Special Rapporteur on promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And then last but by no means least, we have with us Svein Stolen, who is Rector of the University of Oslo. Svein is a Professor of Chemistry. He's also the first President of the Circle U European University Alliance, and he's also Deputy Chair of the Guild of European Research Intensive Universities. Hopefully that gives you a flavour. And Svein has stepped in at very last minute to join this session, so a special thank you for that. So as you know, as you've seen from the conference programme, what we're going to be talking about in this session is academic freedom. Specifically, the role of academic freedom in safeguarding democratic values and in enhancing society. And we want to look not just at the kind of policy behind academic freedom, but also the practice. How do we really ensure that academic freedom is embedded as a lived reality in universities? So hopefully we can really kind of try to get to the heart of that in the session. We're going to start with two introductory speeches. And then after that we'll go into a panel discussion with all four of our panellists. And then finally we'll get to a question and answer session with the audience. So you will have opportunities to ask questions as they come up, as you think of them in the course of the speeches. We also, just to give you a heads up, will have a couple of polls just to kind of get some audience input on a couple of topics later in the session. And we'll be using the Hoover app, which hopefully most of you have got downloaded because it's our conference app. So I just mention this now so that you know that later in the session, if you want to kind of vote in the polls, have your phone or your laptop ready. So I'm going to stop speaking now, and so you can hear from our panelists. And I'm first going to invite David, who with us remotely, as I said, to the stage to give his introductory speech. And David's going to talk about the role that international legal frameworks can play in guaranteeing academic freedom and how universities can actually put these into practice. So David, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you, the floor is yours.
Great, Amanda, thank you so much for including me in this conference. I apologize that in the end I couldn't make it from California to Budapest to be there with you in person. So in the next, say, almost 10 minutes, and I hope that as an academic who likes to speak, that I don't go over that time, that I could really address a few areas of concern related to academic freedom and international law. What does the legal framework look like? But let me start by just acknowledging that there are too many examples in recent experience in which we've seen universities and academics being attacked for the missions that they regularly carry out. from the country where this conference is taking place, which targeted the Central European University and forced it to relocate to a neighboring country, to Turkey's stripping of the independence of university leadership, to global examples of China repressing Uyghur academics and subjecting academics overall to loyalty tests and to gags, to examples in Iran, Uganda, Thailand, the United Arab Emirates, and beyond. Governments often see academic work as a threat. And I think that goes to something essential, something that everybody in this room knows. Universities are engines for knowledge, for science, for the pursuit of progress and truth. A healthy, democratic society is one with open, often well-resourced, but essentially independent universities. They're apolitical in nature, but we live in an age when truth and science are political. They've been politicized. And so academic freedom becomes a threat to those who want propaganda and power to prevail over progress and reality. And few academics, as you all know, come that challenge, and it transforms us and our work and underscores the missions we must pursue. So a few years ago, as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, I reported to the UN General Assembly about the legal framework concerning academic freedom. And I focused in particular on the academic freedom and the right to freedom of expression in international law. So in these brief remarks, please permit me to just say a few words about that legal framework, a few mandates, and then I'll conclude with a few remarks about ensuring broad knowledge of these principles. So first, while for Europeans, the European Convention on Human Rights sets the standard, at the international level, two treaties that bind all states in Europe and set global standards are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And those provide for baseline rules. So the Economic Covenant, for example, protects and promotes everyone's right to education and to access the knowledge created by the advancement of science. The ICCPR, the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, in its Article 19, provides that everyone has the right to hold opinions without interference, and shall also have the right to seek, receive, impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any medium. So opinion may not be restricted under any circumstance, while the freedom of expression is a robust right that may only be restricted in accordance with the three-part test of legality, necessity, and legitimacy. It may, in other words, only be restricted when provided by law and necessary to achieve a legitimate interest, such as the rights of others, public order or national security, or public health or morals. So, of course, it's important to note that freedom of expression does not exist in a vacuum. The Human Rights Committee, the monitoring body for the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has emphasized how freedom of expression is connected to the enjoyment of all other rights. And in the context of academic freedom, we could conceive of others that are connected, from the right to science and education in the Economic Covenant to public participation in the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. So as I wrote in my report to the General Assembly, academic freedom should be understood to include the freedom of individuals as members of academic communities, that is, faculty, students, staff, scholars, administrators, and community participants, or in their own pursuits, that is, individuals in their own pursuits, who are academics, to conduct activities involving the discovery and transmission of information and ideas, and to do so with the full protection of human rights law. So what do these rights mean in practice? I think they can be translated in a variety of ways. Now, on the one hand, of course, there are the state obligations. And I don't want to spend all that much time on those state obligations, except to say that states have two independent roles here. On the one hand, states have the positive obligation to ensure an environment that is supportive of academic freedom. That means ensuring funding, ensuring the availability of space for academics and academic institutions to do their work. But there's also, of course, a negative right associated with that, which is that the state should not use its power in order to penalize individuals or institutions for their academic work. But what about the institutions themselves? So academic freedom, in my view, begins with institutional autonomy and independence, university self-governance. Now, the state must protect that independence vigorously. They must support and promote resources for the university, and they should enable, and this is something we see restricted quite regularly, enable the seeking of resources worldwide. Indeed, recall the right of freedom of expression is one that is enabled regardless of frontiers. It is a global right and transboundary right, and so too should be its support. And universities have a role here too, not merely as passive actors. They should model the kind of search for truth and integrity that they are imparting in their mission and the educational roles that they have. So, for example, they should adopt robust and independent models of self-governance, complete with mechanisms of accountability for abuse, ethical codes of conduct, and assurances that no individual or community within the academic environment will be subjected to any form of penalty or discipline for the exercise of their right to freedom of expression or their academic work. It means protecting the scholarly work, it means protecting curricular decisions, and it means protecting the space for scholars, staff, students, and others to have conversations, to have space in order to promote the advancement of knowledge. It also means ensuring the protection of academic work product, which we may think of often as the work that precedes putting our academic findings into the world, a kind of protection of the right to maintain opinions without interference. The university has a role in ensuring that protection as well. And it also means ensuring protection for academics not only on campus, in their specific educational functions of the university setting, but also, as we know, the public roles that academics often take on generally in promoting their work, in promoting academic freedom to a wider audience. So in the last minute or two that I have here to say a few remarks, let me conclude by mentioning a couple of things. So first, self-governance. What does self-governance mean? Self-governance means ensuring that within the space for academic freedom, institutions act in ways that reflect those roles. And I would highlight two things. Academic institutions must first respect the rights of all members of their communities, all members who participate in academic pursuits. That respect must include the right of all members to freedom of opinion and expression, including, in fact, peaceful protest on academic premises. It also, second, requires ensuring that members of academic communities have protection against coercion by third parties, whether the state or groups in society, because as we all know, the pressure on the university comes not only from the state, but from broader social pressures. So this requires, in particular, that institutions stand up for members of their communities who face attack or restriction owing to the exercise of their freedom of expression and their academic freedom. In sum, this is a role that universities play in advancing knowledge in our societies, but also, and I think this is critical, in supporting the pillars of democratic life. And all of this must be imparted not only to administrators and to university leaders, but also to our students, to those who are the next leaders of our universities, the next leaders in academic communities and in our societies more broadly. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and pass it along to the next person on the panel. And thank you very much for your attention, despite my being remote here today.
Thank you so much, David. I think there was a lot in there we could unpick in the discussion a little bit later. So now I'll move on to our second introductory speaker, who is Christian Ehler, who is going to talk about the European Union's stance on academic freedom and the challenges that Europe is facing today in this respect. So Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear President Murphy, President Czigány, President Borhy, ladies and gentlemen. Academic freedom is a fundamental building block of the European project. And that for a good reason. It is a building block which did constitute the European Union after the Second World War, after the Nazi regime in Europe, and the end of communism after the 1990s. In a historic perspective, when we say never again, we of course first and foremost refer to the horrors of Nazis and Stalinists like Holocaust and Holodomor. And I was really moved when Hungary was joining the European Union, and there was a big celebration done in the upper house of the Hungarian parliament, and when a letter was read to the parliamentarians there from a student who were one of the last protecting this site for the last Russian storm. He was writing to his fiancée about why he's doing that and what it means to be a student, an academic democrat. And he was writing that in the knowledge that he would die what he did the next day. So I think what better place we can choose than Budapest to show the interrelation between democracy, values, and academic freedom, and the role of the academia in general. However, the horrors of the past were made possible by repression of freedom of thought and speech in the very beginning. They were deliberately made possible by destroying first academic freedom and prosecuting intellectuals. If we take the never again serious, we need to take academic freedom serious. As a quick side note, when I refer here to academic freedom, I use that as a reference to both academic freedom and institutional autonomy. These two aspects cannot exist independently, but for the sake of brevity, I will refer to both aspects under the same term, academic freedom. Unfortunately, we have failed in the last few decades to properly protect academic freedom. We have taken academic freedom for granted, and by that we allowed for it to be undermined within the European Union and even more beyond. In the EU, we failed to protect it because we believed the norm to be strong enough. In his memoirs, Jean Monnet wrote, "Rien n'est possible sans les hommes. Rien n'est durable sans les institutions." As we Europeans established a strong norm on academic freedom, yes, but we failed sufficiently to institutionalize it. Academic freedom as a principle is mentioned, as it has been said before, in several European constitutions and in the European Charter for Fundamental Rights. But let's be honest, none of that protected the Central European University from being forced to leave Hungary. And none of that protected the Polish academics when they were taken to court for challenging their narrative about the role of Poland in the Holocaust. Having a norm and general references in constitutional law clearly is not enough to protect academic freedom. We need stronger and clearer legal protection at the European level, and the European legislators need to step up to protect the fundamental part of this European project. This is particularly important because the world is changing and also outside the European Union academic freedom is under pressure. Maintaining academic freedom in a world that looks to Europe as an example is much easier than maintaining it in a world where Europe values are explicitly denounced. Science in a global endeavor, and if academic freedom declines globally, it will affect academic freedom in Europe. For example, the rise of China poses a serious challenge to academic freedom in Europe. There's the obvious impact of academic freedom through founding programs like the Confucius Institutes. However, there's a threat on a more fundamental level. With the growing power of China in the international system, regimes that undermine academic freedom have a political safe haven. Europe's answer must be that we become the global safe haven for academic freedom. From my perspective, this is one of the most important issues that should occupy European policymakers at the moment. That is why I have been pushing for Europe to set up a fellowship scheme for researchers at risk. And at that point, I would like to salute you and refer to Maria Gabriel. I talked to her in the very morning, and we're going to set up a scheme for Ukrainian researchers at risk, immediately funded out of Marie Curie. First of all, 25 million that could even raise, but we're envisaging to have something more. I think we should have a program for academics at risk, a fundamental program for academics at risk in Europe. We should be the safe haven for that. And that is to be funded, and the European Parliament started this initiative already. We have started to negotiate with the Council and the Commission, and you're going to see that in the next years happening. Member States and Commission were not happy when we proposed to include a reference to academic freedom in the biggest civilian research program in the world, Horizon Europe. After 17 hours of negotiation, the last point left of all was a reference to academic freedom. And there was almost no majority in the Council for that. It had been really the Parliament. We were sitting with the Council and the Commission in the very moment, at 4:30 in the morning. It was the last point to agree on. And we succeeded, and we did that on a purpose. I say that clearly here as budget rapporteur for the European Parliament. That was meant by the Parliament to enforce academic freedom by neglecting members, neglecting funding for the ones not obeying to academic freedom. There is a clear reference in the funding program in Europe about academic freedom. Who is going to violate that has to answer questions about why it is funded. To make it more concrete, let me shortly highlight a couple of developments in Brussels. One important development is that the Commission and the Member States now seem to recognize that something needs to happen on academic freedom. It is one of the points in the policy agenda of the European research area. It promises that academic freedom will be monitored in Europe. However, there are three important weaknesses in this policy agenda. Firstly, and most importantly, it's a voluntary effort. Member states that do not want to participate don't have to. So this will do nothing for protecting academic freedom in those European countries where they are mostly under pressure. Secondly, the monitoring will be developed very slowly, and there is no plan on what to do if a member state falls below a European standard for academic freedom. Thirdly, it is run by the member states and the Commission. This means that stakeholders take a backseat. This is highly problematic because academic freedom is first and foremost an issue that should be shaped by the academic community, not by politicians. My faith in the work of the Commission and Member States is sometimes shaken. That is why I think the Parliament should be a driving force within the institutions to move Europe forward on academic freedom. In my views, the Parliament can offer the most independent platform for the academic community to shape academic freedom within the European policy context. In particular, I believe there's an important role for that, what I'm representing as chair of the European think tank, the STOA panel. The STOA panel is the think tank of the European Parliament. It is set up particularly to provide a platform for foresight and science-based policy discussions within the Parliament, but also within the European institutions. As such, it is the only non-partisan body of members of the European Parliament. I was recently elected as chair, and I intend to make academic freedom as the key priority to STOA in the coming years. It will provide a comprehensive and independent monitoring of academic freedom in Europe from the end of the year. And it will be a platform for debates with the sector on how to better protect academic freedom. Furthermore, I will initiate a Parliament report on academic freedom with as its goal to force the Commission to put forward a proposal for better legal protection of the academic freedoms. We have to change the treaties. To conclude, Brussels is moving on academic freedom, and we need to be moving together with the academic sector. I think it's of utmost importance for us to understand that politics can enforce academic freedom and should be. It should lay down the constitutional and legal foundation for that. But it's a very delicate issue how to negotiate that. What constitutes academic freedom? And we are willing, by collaborating specifically in the EUA, who have been very active in recent years, and I can salute that, and I can imagine that it's not so easy, because it is also internally not such an easy discussion. But I think we have to re-establish the norm for academic freedom in Europe. We need to institutionalize that norm through effective legal protection at European level for academic freedom. We need enforcement mechanism. Europe can and should be a global leader on academic freedom, but we can only do so if we have our own house in order. The 20th century taught us very important lessons, and we have to build an unparalleled academic sector on those lessons. Now we need to fight to preserve this vital part of the European project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your words, and I'm sure I can echo, I'm sure everybody would agree here that the announcement about the scholarship fund for Ukraine, we're absolutely delighted about that. So, before we actually go on with our discussion, I mentioned at the beginning we were going to have a couple of polling questions. The polling you should see, the question we're asking you is there a legal or regulatory commitment to academic freedom in your academic environment? And essentially your options are, yes, there is such a framework in the national legal framework, regional legal framework, in the university statutes. Yes, there is something, but the practice is a little bit different. No, or I don't know. And I appreciate that obviously in some cases it may be a number of those different things, but obviously just pick the one that's actually most relevant to you. So that's interesting. So the results there, I think, if everybody's voted who are going to vote, clearly the top one there is, yes, there is something at the national level legally. Followed by, after that, yes, university statutes, but also quite a big number of responses for I don't know, which I think is very interesting in itself and something that maybe we could reflect on later. And interesting also that very little there about what's happening at a regional level in terms of legal frameworks. So I leave those thoughts with you, and that's something you can come back to, and maybe the speakers may want to refer to in some of their answers. But to kick off our discussion, I'd like to first turn to Spain and Adam, as they also haven't had a chance to address us yet. And I'd like to ask you both, in your opinion, how do you think that international frameworks for academic freedom actually affect universities in practice? Or do they affect universities in practice? So, Zane, please go ahead.
So, first of all, very happy to be here, so thanks for the invitation, and thanks also for the speakers that have started. And I'm also very happy to hear a very proactive policy from MP Eller, and I think that's very encouraging. I think freedom of speech and also academic freedom is easy to support when you agree with the speaker, agree with the research that is proposed, and then it is extremely important that we also defend it, of course, when the questions we pose are more difficult to accept. So for that reason, I believe that international frameworks do make a big difference. I think that the Magna Carta, which was started in 1988 with some countries, some university also became a member. Today it's 900 and something members that support this agenda. I think that's been very important for the academic community as such. I also find the Bonn Declaration extremely important. The freedom of scientific research, commit the EU member states and also EEA countries like Norway to the right to freely define research questions. It makes clear that critical discourse is not disloyalty, it's essential for the democratic development, and it's anchored in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, of course. But I think that we need to do more, and that is also what MBA was clear about here. We need to look into how we proactively defend through what we do every day at the university. So there are different roles here, of course. We have to do this every day, proactively defending academic freedom, freedom of speech, in the labs, in the boardrooms, in the classrooms. Students are extremely important here, of course. But I think also that we need to do more from a European level. So the European Court of Justice, for example, what they can do is critical. And through the Guild of European research-intensive universities, we also called for the creation of an ombudsperson that could help us also look into particular cases within the countries that are a member of Horizon Europe and the European Research Area and the European Education Area, which I think is extremely important. Maybe I can start there and then I can continue a little bit later.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to this important event. Answering your question, I think that certainly different international, regional or domestic documents guaranteeing academic freedom are important in terms of strengthening certain values and in terms of showing that that kind of values should be respected in a society. But the problem is, what happens if the whole state is trying to undermine basic democratic values, is undermining freedom of speech, pluralism of the discussion, and artistic freedom? Because at a certain point in time, this attitude also transfers into the academia. So academia is not, let's say, innocent or cannot isolate itself from some general political conditions that are undermining basic human rights and liberal values. And I think that is the major problem. Not whether we have some groundbreaking declarations, soft law documents, or even the constitutional provisions, or provisions like Article 13 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, but the problem is whether those provisions are followed in practice. Because one of the problems we may see is the use of different kinds of soft mechanisms via which you undermine those basic academic freedoms. So on the one hand, you say that yes, we are a country respecting those basic academic, those basic values, including academic freedom. We are belonging to European nations. We are part of the European culture. But in a daily practice, in different kinds of situations, you try to undermine by saying that the science should promote some national values, or that science and research should concentrate on only those issues that are expected from scholars to deal with, or that certain scholars are targeted with either sanctions or some forms of reprisals, or are blocked in terms of promotion, or it may happen, as it happened here, that the whole university is expelled from the country. I mean here the Central European University. I would like to underline that I'm a graduate of the Central European University, and for me it is really something almost like a trauma coming here to Budapest and not being able to see my alma mater in a situation when Hungary is still the member state of the European Union. So I think that what is at stake here is practice, not some general declarations, but what is at stake is how to enhance those general statements, constitutional-like statements, with some methodologies and infrastructure in order to protect really academic freedom. And taking into account my experience as the ombudsman, I have some ideas how to do it, but maybe I will leave it for the later discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both very much indeed. I mean, I asked you there about the international frameworks, and just as a follow-up question to you both, I'd like to know how helpful do you think European policy initiatives are in increasing academic freedom at universities, and how important it is for you to have action at European level, such as the type that was outlined earlier?
I think that those activities at the European level are important because they somehow, I think they push academic institutions into this direction, that in order to be in this community of other universities, be in this framework of cooperation with the European Commission, to be in the context of receiving grants, simply you must not misbehave. So simply you must keep certain standards of academic freedom. It does not mean that thanks to those initiatives, you will basically you will just follow all the rules and you will behave like the most free in the world academic institutions, but at least you will try to keep some standards. So I would say that different European initiatives have something like the stabilization roles for universities. Please look at the anti-discrimination provisions at the European Union level. Those provisions exist. The European Union has quite a wide competence to regulate different issues concerning protection against discrimination. And despite different challenges, including in my country, with respect to anti-discrimination laws, no country has decided to reconsider those provisions or to openly challenge those provisions, and still people have access to remedies. So I think I would treat it the same by promotion of certain values at the EU level, including certain mechanisms of financing. In fact, we are putting leverage over member states in order not to undermine some basic values of academic freedom. But still we should remember about all those examples of the institutional threats to academic freedom that happened, that still happen. We should remember that it is sometimes very difficult to challenge some of the domestic regulations just on spot, and this whole machinery of the European Union needs time to react. And finally, we should remember about some individual scholars that are under pressure. And I don't mean only scholars at risk, I mean simply scholars who cannot get promotion, who cannot get access to grants, who cannot get proper employment, or that are, for example, fired from public institutions if they try to combine their academic work and their proper independent research with some work in some state institutions. So even if you have the most beautiful and wide-reaching European mechanisms, they may not prevent such things to happen.
I will try with 3 short points. First of all, you tie national politicians to the mast, and in fact also decision makers, including rectors. So you tie them by having a set of regulations on an over-national level. The second is, of course, that the academic society, research and innovation, research and education innovation, for that sake, is not national endeavors. They are international in nature. I think 70% of the papers produced at the University of Oslo are co-authored by foreign researchers. Hence, we need to have the same type of consistent national policy throughout Europe. So this helps us to copy, spread good practice, and I think that's important. And lastly, I would say that we also need to discuss why academic freedom has value to society. That's obvious for us as researchers, but for society at large, that's not obvious. And we need to have that discussion not only in each individual country, but we need to have that in Europe and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'd like to address a question now specifically to David. David, in your position as United Nations Special Rapporteur, you obviously authored recommendations for academic institutions on this topic. And I wonder, could you tell us, what do you think is the single most important action for university leaders to take to ensure that that they have the right to freedom of expression and opinion in their institution? You know, what would be your sort of one message of sort of, do this now if you do anything?
It's a great question. Of course, it's so difficult. It's so difficult to answer, in part because there are just so many pressures on academics, from social pressures to state pressures. But I do think there's something that's absolutely essential about university leadership standing up for the academic freedom of their staff. And I want to emphasize this, it's staff also, because we've seen in places around the world that it's not only the scholars and the students who face pressures against their academic freedom, but it's also the staff as well. So I think it's absolutely essential that university leaders stand up for those who are within the academic community, and that means promoting their academic freedom. It does, in certain contexts, involve promoting certain standards for freedom of expression and for allowing the full range of views to be expressed on campuses, because I think all of us who are on college, university, or other academic environments know today there's extreme pressure to limit freedom of expression from those with whom we disagree. And so it's really essential for the leaders of academic institutions to be providing the fundamental message about the importance of academic freedom, about the importance of institutional autonomy, making those arguments to political leaders, to the community as well, but really being the voice for that.
Great, thank you so much. And then a question now to Christian. So you talked to us about obviously what the European Parliament is doing in this area. So I'm interested to know how you ensure buy-in from the university sector when you're actually developing things. How you think the top-down policy angle can actually be best combined with the bottom-up institutional angle?
I mean, if you're realistic, there was not much of buying in from the university sector so far. I mean, I told you about the problems even to establish a reference in the spending program to academic freedom in the council. And that's the state of play, that's worrisome. What I envisage is, and that is why I was following the advice, and actually the brilliant example of EUA, starting a scheme to monitoring the academic freedom, although we are all aware that is a very complex discussion what that constitutes. But I think, and that's not because I'm referring to the Parliament as an institution, I'm referring to the democratic process. And if there is a level of interaction which is not a top-down level, then it is to work with parliaments. Because that is the logic process where citizens, and in the end, you also are citizens, engage with politics. And what we want to do, quite practically, is that the think tank of the European Parliament is setting up now a substantial funding scheme to develop till the end of the year, together with the stakeholders. Actually, we are asking the stakeholders to do. We will do a call, so we are not involved as an institution as it would be the Commission and national government. We are granting a call to the academia in Europe to define what should constitute academic freedom. And it will be a step-by-step case. What we want to do first is to help us to constitute that, and then we as an institution every year would do a monitor of the state of play of academic freedom. But we wouldn't do that on our own purpose or us deciding. It would be a way that the constituted academia in Europe would decide, but use the Parliament then to announce that. That is the state of play announced by the President of the European Parliament. And I think we are well aware about this delicate, fragile kind of way to approach the problem. Because I think a top-down approach coming from governments or coming from the institution is on the one hand welcome, but on the other hand very much problematic. And I think the approach, and it's just an attempt, and I don't want to promise everything, but the idea of the European Parliament to let, first of all, in a call, the Academia of Europe decide what constitutes that, and then, in a way, looking for a system where we would monitor, you would monitor, but you would use one of the three institutions, the legislative body, to then announce in public this state of play. That could be a way, what you told or said as buy-in or obeying to this fragile kind of interrelation between politics and the academia itself.
Thank you very much. Before I open it to the audience for questions, which I'm sure there are many, we'll just have our second poll. We've heard lots of mentions already in our discussion today about threats to academic freedom. So the next thing we want to ask you in the second poll is, where do you think the threat to academic freedom is predominantly coming from? So who or what is mainly responsible for exerting pressure on academic freedom? So if you go to the polls again on the app, you have a choice between politicians and public authorities, university leadership, economic pressures and funding constraints, students, or once again, I don't know. I'll give you a moment or two to answer. It's open, good. Sorry? Currently people can't. It's loading. Okay. Why don't we run it then? Because we can come back to the results of this in a minute. Why don't we open it to questions for the audience? Again, you can vote in your own time, and we'll come back to it at the end. There will be people coming around with microphones. So if you'd like to ask a question to any of our speakers, if you could just raise your hand. Go ahead. So. Yeah, just at that, thank you. And if you could briefly introduce yourself and say what organisation you're from, that would be really helpful, thank you.
I'm Livy Matej from King's College London. Previously I worked for 23 years at Central European University, and if anybody thinks that my living CEU has anything to do with the missing clothes of a particular king or Prime Minister from a particular country, that is true. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I would like to say a few words about what I think is a very dangerous trend in the discussion and also in the efforts to protect academic freedom in Europe. And I will need a lot more time to explain, but I'll be short. So there is a tendency, which was also manifest in our discussion now, to consider that academic freedom can be reduced to the freedom of expression, or that they are the same, or they can be substituted. And in the discussion today, there was a kind of moving very fast sometimes from academic freedom to freedom of expression. I don't think I need to convince anybody in this room that academic freedom and freedom of expression are not the same. They are two different rights, they are both of them important. But academic freedom doesn't cover a lot of what academic freedom covers, and that is true both when we are talking about conceptualizing, codifying academic freedom and in practice. And I know of universities in Europe, and I will mention none, which have a committee for protection of freedom of expression in that university, but not a committee for protection of academic freedom. And that is very interesting, and we can discuss why. And in part, this transgression happens because the public and the media understands a lot easier freedom of expression rather than academic freedom. So just to end, I would say, we are at a time of crisis of academic freedom in Europe, but there are very interesting efforts to overcome this crisis, both in terms of reconceptualizing codifying, building frameworks for the practice of academic freedom and practices, and some of the leaders of these efforts are here in the room, whether it is the Parliament, Magna Carta, Universitatul EUA, the Guild of Research Intensive Universities. And what I would like to say, let's not make the mistake to reduce academic freedom to freedom of expression.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Do any of our speakers want to comment on that? Or...
I think I didn't mix this, but I think that I need to maybe explain a little bit some of the context of my statement. My point was that in a situation when you go towards something like a illiberal democracy, then it affects first freedom of speech, artistic freedom, and then it affects also academic freedom. So the general conditions of talking about different issues and shrinking so-called public space for discussion affects not only media, civil society, but also academia. And academia, at a certain point, cannot protect itself from a certain general trend that happens in a country, and this trend is even more dangerous because academic freedom includes also the not only individual freedom but also freedom of institutions to operate. So this institutional aspect of the academic freedom, as it was underlined in the Court of Justice judgment commissioned against Hungary, is extremely important in this sense. Thank you.
I think I agree completely. I hope I haven't said anything wrong in that respect, but I would like to say that in Norway, we have recently also had a new expert report commissioned by the government on academic freedom of speech. So they introduced a whole new type of problem. That's also interesting, which is related to this. But of course, academic freedom is what is important. It is under pressure for several reasons, and that is what we also need to defend as rectors.
Thank you. So, next question, thank you.
Yes, Karl Tomre, Vice President of the University of Lorraine in France. I happen to think exactly as a colleague from the UK, which is interesting to perceive when somebody from France and from the UK thinks the same. No, I'm not from France. No, actually it's quite tricky because we have this freedom of speech, as we'll discuss, so I will not come back to that. We have the academic freedom, that is freedom to be able to do the teaching and do the research without having instructions from government or whoever on what you are going to teach or what you are going to research. And then the third one, that was interesting what you have in Oslo, because we saw that in the COVID time, in France at least, we have dear colleagues, academics, who, because they have this authority of an academic person, have very strong opinions on things where they have not scientific qualifications. That means that this freedom comes with duties. The duty of the expression, academic expression, comes with the duty of being based on scientific, solid facts, scientific method. That was what kind of question I had to the panelists. Do we have this counterpart guaranteeing academic freedom and academic freedom of speech based on also a solid basis in the scientific method with which you come with your thoughts? Because we have seen in these last years well-known professors saying things which have no scientific foundations and putting forward that they are academics.
Thanks for your question. I would just, before I hand over to the panelists to answer, just to stress that we'll be talking more about freedom of expression and this specific issue in free speech in later sessions of the conference as well. But who'd like to go first?
I think that Thank you. I mean, not to reiterate the role, and you see me as a proud parliamentarian. What we're doing is the think tank of the European Parliament had been developing an instrument which is called Science Media Hub. And what we're doing is we want to force the discussion between media, society, and scientists of the way we are presenting scientific research, scientific evidence in public. You have been mentioning the case when someone is pretty much referring to a subject where he has no expertise. But in Corona, the problem was in real terms because we had been analyzing information about Corona. And where was, let's say, where started confusion? And that's the dialectic nature of the academia itself. So you have in medical thought, you have usually the mainstream thought, and then you have a certain minority. That is needed because by that minority standpoint you could develop science further. In public and in a state of emergency, it's very problematic. We saw that there were in public extreme minority positions presented even by experts, but neither the media nor the expert was referring to what he was presenting the majority of thought, or was he presenting an extreme minority of thought. So I think it is a learning process of society, media, and science in general, and how to present scientific evidence in general. And in the past, it was very much based on the statue of the one presenting an institution, being a professor. That was seen by society then as a given expertise and a kind of neutral reflection of that. And we saw, sometimes even not on purpose, that we transferred an academic discussion, which is needed between minority positions and majority positions, in public without setting that in any kind of context. So we had experts, and there are experts who thought that vaccines would be very problematic, but they were representing just 2 or 3% of the general discussion. And I think that is something where society, media, politics, and science have to come to a different and better understanding how to communicate. And that's the reason why the Parliament said it was setting up this Science Media Hub, where we do discuss and try to teach also media to understand who they are talking to. Thank you very much.
David, did you want to comment? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to just say very briefly that I agree with both of the comments and questions that were raised, but I want to emphasize that in my presentation, what I was trying to argue, and indeed in my past role as Special Rapporteur, that freedom of expression protects academic freedom in certain ways. But academic freedom is something different. And academic freedom, and I think this is important, certainly from the human rights perspective, that academic freedom also involves other rights, other civil and political rights, but also the protection of rights to education, of rights to the advancement of science and the accessibility of those rights. And so as we think about those things, I think it's also useful to be thinking about the self-governing quality and the self-governing imperative, not only of academic institutions, but academic communities that create standards for knowledge and its dissemination and the debates around certain arguments that are made, how we test hypotheses and so forth. So I agree with that sort of fundamental point that was made before, and think that we can generally think broadly about all of these issues together, but not conflate them all at the same time.
Great, thank you. And did we have some more hands over in the same area, I think?
Hi, I'm Rector from the University of Helsinki, and in a previous EUA meeting in Paris a few years ago, we discussed the role of universities in society, and there were a lot of talk about sustainability and responsible research and that kind of aspects. So now that I came to this session, I was really excited about the aspect of academic freedom, because I think myself and many of us have teenagers at home, and I tend to tell them that with freedom comes responsibility. So now that I've listened to these presentations here, I haven't once heard the word responsibility. So my question is then, have I been teaching my kids falsely? Because the only time I think David touched this when he said that there's a kind of a responsibility at the institutional level to secure the academic freedom. So, but I think because my field is doctoral education, but we also try to teach our PhD students is values of responsible research, and this goes from the individual to the institutional level. And those aspects, I think they are related to academic freedom very much. So I'd like to maybe hear a few comments on the responsibility. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So how about responsibility?
I can start. Responsibility always follows freedom, for sure. Also for academics, that's important. Of course, I think also that a part of what we are discussing then is the trust in science. Because if you're not able to present your research in a way that really builds up the trust in science, we're doing something wrong for the global academic society. You need to be knowledge-based, you need to present the method, you need not at least to present uncertainty of talent. And we see that the interaction between the press and the scientists from time to time also makes this quite difficult. For that reason, we need to teach norms and standards for research ethics and integrity. We need to do that for the grown-up professors. We need to do this also for young students, of course. It's extremely important that freedom is followed by responsibility.
First of all, I would like to say that in the most of my university, there's a word responsibility, because that is how we treat our job. Second, I wanted to say that coming back a little bit to this discussion about freedom of speech and academic freedom, if we look into the Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, it says that exercise of this freedom, since it carries duties and responsibilities, might be subject of several limitations. So basically how the European Convention on Human Rights of 1950 is basically putting responsibilities and duties connected with the exercise of it as inherent in the whole value of freedom. And I think it is of course important in the context of academic teachers and the world of academia, because it means that you shouldn't abuse your freedom. I think that when you are talking, for example, or expressing your views using your academic titles on an issue in which you are not an expert, or if you are abusing your title in order to comment on issues that are not at all subject of your competence, then simply you are abusing your academic freedom, not academic freedom, but more your freedom of speech as an academic teacher. But when we are talking about responsibility, I think it is, one thing is internal responsibility towards our students, as you suggested, but I think the big question is to what extent you should be responsible for the external world. So let's imagine that there are some threats around you concerning, let's say, values of democracy, rule of law. Should you comment this? Or should you be just like in this position, okay, let's wait 5 years and later on I will comment on this in a proper academic journal. I am of the opinion that if you have the specialist knowledge, you should comment, because that is what the society is expecting from you. You should not be silent, but still, if you are commenting, you should do it in a proper academic way and not just by using your academic knowledge in order to promote some kind of a political vision that you are having in mind. Thank you.
What I'm going to say might not raise my popularity in that room, but I mean, what had been said in terms of responsibility is clear. But if we are clearly analyzing what happens during Corona, the major challenge, to be honest, was not so much the responsibility questions of individuals, although we had been analyzing who had been saying something and then had been analyzing had there been any kind of reactions from their individual societies or whatever, and there was almost nothing, interestingly. So also the internal enforcement seems to be a little bit of a question in terms of responsibility. But the major problem, if you're honest, and although that might not be so popular, is I think that academia, as politics and society in general, had been falling back in terms of understanding the communication realities of the 21st century. I think we still believe that this kind of dialectic discourse, as it is in the academia, and it might be its distinguished colleagues who is presenting on a conference the most exotic position, that would be seen as a contribution to the dialectic forthcoming of science. Whereas the logic of social media and modern media and the speed of media is, to be honest, not understood by the academia. And isn't reflected neither in the institutions, in their training, in their abilities, maybe also in terms of funding. And so I think one of the biggest lessons in terms of responsibility is whatever good you want, and the responsibility is really that academia interfering in a societal discussion as it had been around Corona has to be more responsible about understanding how this modern form of societal communication based on social media works. Because otherwise, everyone is convinced in principle terms there is a peer group understanding about being responsible. But the results can be anyway devastating if you don't understand the logic of this kind of societal communication based on social media.
David, did you want to have the last word on this topic?
Just to say two things. The first is, it's true that I didn't use the language of responsibility, but when I'm talking about ethical codes of conduct, and other kinds of self-governance mechanisms, I think that includes the idea of ensuring, promoting responsibility for one's research, for how one discusses that research, and so forth. So I agree with that on one point, but I just wanted to note on the word responsibility, and Adam mentioned its appearance in the European Convention on Human Rights. My allergy, let me say, to the word comes from the fact that states often use the word responsibility in order to impose restrictions on academic freedom and freedom of expression. And so my only plea really is, on the one hand, for institutions to in fact exercise responsibility, but also to be mindful of the fact that language is often used as a tool to restrict our ability to do the work that we do.
I know you can't see the room here, but there's a lot of nodding at that comment, just to let you know. Okay, thanks. We're out of time almost, unfortunately. It's gone by very fast, but I wanted, before we finish, to just show the poll results if we have those available, and then I'll just give each of the panelists 30 seconds if they want to kind of comment on it or make any closing statements. So here we go. Who is mainly responsible for pressure on academic freedom? So the winner, if you like, is politicians and public authorities, followed by economic pressures and funding constraints, nothing for students, a little bit for university leadership, and a tiny bit of I don't know. So I'm just going to give you, as I say, 30 seconds each. Are you surprised by that? And are there any kind of final comments you'd like to make about So I'm going to start with you.
Thank you very much for having the chance for this last word. I would like to share with you my experience as being the ombudsman of the Republic of Poland. These were quite difficult times, and there were moments when I was under quite significant pressure. But one of the things that worked really and helped me a lot was the support from my colleagues from the world that were associated within the International Ombudsman Institute. And once they even did something like a fact-finding mission to Poland in order to check basically what is happening and to produce some important statement and the report. And why I'm saying this? Because I think that we have quite many, not only scholars at risk, but also, I would name it, scholars under threat, scholars under pressure. And maybe it would be a good idea to develop that kind of initiative. Maybe there are already good initiatives, but as far as I, for example, observe my friend Wojciech Sadurski, who was subject of, I think, 5 strategic lawsuits against public participation for his public comments, I think he was not subject of any fact-finding mission or visit. Or if I know some professors that are waiting for the full professorship and they are basically refused because of political reasons to have this full professorship, I think that kind of people also require some attention. So if you can consider maybe forming that kind of initiative, that in case you are having like the reliable, good, important case of some academic freedom under threat or under pressure, you are sending a fact-finding mission of 3-5 professors, and then you are preparing a report on this. That is the greatest solidarity thing you may do, and in practical terms to support scholars at risk. Thank you very much.
I guess there is a tendency that research has to give way for other objectives, so to say, for the useful in a short time framework, for security policies, for personnel policies, for regional and national needs, for the logics of the media, maybe also through the tendency for society to disregard knowledge and experts. So I think it's a lot of different things. I'm not surprised by the one at the top, because a lot of what I mentioned now relates to politics. When we attack that, we have to attack the whole width of different challenges, of course, and we have to stand up and defend academic freedom also in the years to come.
First of all, I would like to thank you, and I'd like to thank EU, because what you have been starting with monitoring academic freedom was the kickstart for the discussion. It's not up to me to present warnings, but having seen the relation to deprived funding and so on, so I think we have to be careful, because if we broaden the discussion too much, we get in this intellectual and moral superiority of the victim. So you might broaden that academically in a delicious way, but we might not find a way really to enforce it, neither to lay it down in a constitutional, in a legal sense. So politics is waiting. Yes, you have to kick us a little bit further, but I think that the Parliament on the European level started a process interacting with you. We're looking for robust ways for enforcement, and I say that openly. You saw that the Commission yesterday started the rule of law process against the member states. We are politely not mentioning here. And that is that Europe wants to fight for its values, and we broaden that to the question of academic freedom by neglecting funding, by expelling from programs, and at worst, really identifying what is going wrong in some of the member states. And in more practical terms, what we are looking for, and that you would have to help us, I think we, for the moment, are intelligent enough to understand that that can't be a top-down kind of process. So perhaps peer reviews, these internal instruments as we have with the ERC or something like that, could be the judging instrument for something than politics via programs, via legal framework, and via constitutional foundations would enforce. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Any comments on the results? Any final comments you'd like to make?
Thank you, and thanks to the EUA for inviting me. And again, I'm just so disappointed not to be there with you in person. As I look at this poll, although I recognize that the economic pressures and funding constraints have a variety of reasons behind them, it seems that close to 90% of the responses indicate a kind of political nature of pressure on academic freedom, because of course part of seeking financial support for institutions is also a part of the political process. And so I suppose I would go back to what Christian Taylor was saying about social media in a way, because I believe that there's a way in which university leaders, without becoming political themselves, need to be standing up for academic freedom and playing a role in supporting and promoting the fundamental values of academic freedom and of academic institutions. I know that's easier said than done, but that seems to be where we are today. Using the tools of modern communication is part of that. But really taking that role and that responsibility, if I could use that word here, I think is part of the real challenge for all of us today.
Thanks very much indeed. And I have to say, I can kind of say my sort of closing reflection on this session in one sentence is it leaves you with the impression that there is clearly work to do, but I think you can see that things are moving and there is commitment to do it. So, and I think I'd like to stress that, obviously I hope it goes without saying to everybody here that EUA is completely committed to this topic and these efforts, and will, help in whatever way we can. So, with that, I'd just like to thank all our panelists for their candid insights and their expertise today. Will you join me in thanking them in the usual way?